So we have a minute to go and we'll start very shortly.
All right.
Thank you, those of us who've joined us. Okay, we are at 2 o'clock Eastern time. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, which is part of the a series of webinar on international education organized by the School of Education's Global and International Initiative. In this webinar, professionalism and netiquette are to be maintained in all of our communications. Personal attacks will not be tolerated. The webinar will take the form of a 30-minute conversation followed by a 20-minute question and answer. Please post your questions at any time, and at the end of 30 minutes, we'll direct them to our guest speakers. Our guests today are Dr. Qargha and Dean Mason. Dr. Qargha is the former Chief Technical Advisor for the Afghanistan Ministry of Education, and Dean Mason is Dean Emeritus of the School of Education. Dr. Qargha and Dean Mason, welcome and thank you. Please proceed.
Good afternoon or good evening or hello to everyone who's joined us for the webinar today. I'm Terry Mason. I'm former Dean of the School of Education, former professor in curriculum and instruction. And today's webinar will be focusing on education in Afghanistan, particularly higher education in part. And also we will be hearing from our guest speaker, Omar Qargha, who will talk to us a little bit about his recent dissertation research on private schooling in Afghanistan. And then we'll have an opportunity later for people to ask questions. And these can be about the specific content that we'll be discussing around Afghanistan education today, or other related questions concerning the current situation in Afghanistan with regard to education. Let's probably limit it to that. So just as a brief introduction, our guest today, Omar Qargha, is a recent doctoral recipient from the University of Maryland, where he had received his doctorate in education, in international education, and defended his dissertation just a very short time ago, a few weeks ago. I had the privilege of serving on that dissertation committee, and I can attest to the fact that it was a very, very excellent dissertation study, and he will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Prior to that, Omar received his master's degree from Stanford in international and comparative education in 2011. Before that, a master's in education and curriculum and instruction from George Mason University in 2006. And he received his undergraduate degree in chemistry from the University of North Florida in 1997. So he has a varied background in science and education, and has worked extensively in those areas. My own experience with Omar goes back to around 2006, when Indiana University was a partner in the Afghanistan Higher Education Project, funded by USAID. And I was directing the teacher education portion of that project. And Omar joined that team for the higher education project and was very instrumental in developing teacher education curriculum for math and science, organizing professional development for university instructors in the field of math and science education, as well as a number of other activities for that project. He also has worked on USAID projects in Afghanistan in workforce development and in teacher education development and assessment. So as we get started here this afternoon, I wanted to have Omar start and talk a little bit in some detail about his education work in Afghanistan, highlighting some of the things that I mentioned that he's worked on. So Omar, why don't we start with that? Why don't you talk a little bit about these projects that you've done over these several years in education in Afghanistan?
Sure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to share a forum with you and speak with Indiana University colleagues, especially on education in Afghanistan. Before starting my own work, I enjoyed the work that we did with the higher education project, and Indiana University was critical and setting up some foundational teacher training programs. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. My background in education in Afghanistan is, I'm originally from Afghanistan. I was born there, but I had to leave the country when I was very young during the Soviet invasion. And then I grew up in Florida, and until 2000, I didn't go back to Afghanistan. My first trip back was in 2000, which coincidentally was the Taliban were still in power at that point. It was sort of those trips at the younger age of doing the trips around Europe, and then ended up in Afghanistan. After coming back, I started with a small nonprofit organization. It was called Help the Afghan Children. And in that area, I did pretty much everything related to education. We did building schools, we did teacher training for very small groups of people, and computer literacy in these things. Afterwards, I moved to a USAID project that worked on developing standards for teachers. And that was to develop competencies of how do you measure quality of teaching and anywhere, and especially a place like Afghanistan. And then after that, time with the Ministry of Education, and I should mention that in Afghanistan, there are two bodies responsible for the overall education. There's two other bodies as well, but the Ministry of Education deals with education from kindergarten to 12th grade now. It used to be till 14th. And then the higher education deals in the higher education work. I joined Indiana University at that time. I think it was about the 2006 time. And you covered a lot of the work that we did there. One of the critical things that we did was to try and bridge this, the gap between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Higher Education. The Ministry of Higher Education was responsible for training teachers. The Ministry of Education employed them, but there was no communication. Not even the curriculum of the Ministry of Education was being taught at Ministry of Higher Education. So we were successfully built standards for teacher education between these two. Afterwards, I went into the private sector for a while. I started a private international school that's still going on, barely. It's been very difficult in the last few years. And my last post was to serve as the chief technical advisor for the Minister of Education in Afghanistan. I served in that role for about 14 months prior to the fall of the government. And the mandate that we had during that time was to reimagine education for Afghanistan, meaning to work on its sustainability, scalability, and to work out issues that are causes of conflict. So we did a couple of major things during this time. One was to devise an overall educational reform agenda, which then manifested itself into the first national education policy for Afghanistan. That required structural reforms for the ministry and financial reforms. We we put the groundwork for all of this during our time in Afghanistan. But then I was there on my last trip until I think August 1st or 5th, something like that. I came to the US for a short stay to go back in 2 weeks, and then August 15th happened and the government fell, and this whole new political scenario took place in Afghanistan. So that's sort of a brief overall discussion of what I was involved in with education in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Omar. That, I think, portrays very nicely the extent and the breadth of the work that you've been involved in. And I know that you've been, in recent times, you've served as an advisor to the Minister of Education prior to the fall of the government in August that you mentioned, and also to the President of Afghanistan himself as an educational advisor, working on issues of policy and some of the things that you just mentioned. Now, let's turn for a few minutes to the work you did for your dissertation research. You were dealing with the rather complex set of issues surrounding private education in Afghanistan. Delivering quality education in Afghanistan to students there has been a challenge, let's say, for many years due to the conflict that we know about that existed there for so many years. And then I recall, for example, when I first went to Afghanistan around 2005, it was shortly after the first time in which the Taliban were in power. And as you all know, I believe, during that Taliban period, girls were prohibited really from attending school. And so as I arrived in Kabul in my first visits there, I remember in the mornings going to the office or wherever in the city and seeing children going to school, but very few of them, and even fewer girls on their way to school. However, several years later, in the same situation in the morning, going to work, seeing children heading to school, I was amazed at the increased number of children going to school and the increased number of girls at that time as well. So we were seeing progress in those years between 2005 and 6 and up to around 2010. Just to say that the work that we were doing and others were doing in education during those years was yielding some excellent results in many different ways. But as I mentioned, private education was one of the means by which education was being provided. And as I said, in your dissertation, you deal with the complexities of private education, the challenges that it faces, and the policy implications for private education and as well as public education and how they operate together. Omar, why don't you talk to us a little bit about that dissertation work, some of the things that you found, and some of the implications of your work for the current situation in education in Afghanistan. Omar?
Sure. So as you rightfully laid the context, education, sort of modern schooling, if we can focus on the terms, modern schooling in Afghanistan has been it started in 1919, but it's had a rocky road ever since its inception. And the issue of conflict in education, issue of sustainability of education, financing of education, quality, access, equity, all of these things have been challenges that the country has been trying to overcome. These challenges, as throughout the history of the country, if you look at it, the country makes some progress, and then a revolution, an invasion, some sort of a political change takes place, which then restarts a lot of the work. And my interest in this greater focus of the dissertation was to kind of look at how policies of education are made, and fragile, conflict-affected states. And privatization of education was a new initiative prior to the fall of the Taliban in 2001 and the international communities entering into Afghanistan. Private schools were extremely limited. There was maybe at most 2-3 private schools that catered, and this was in the 1960s and 70s, that catered to foreign nationals who had brought their families. The policies did not actually allow for Afghans to go to private schools. This changed after 2001, and specifically in 2006, when the policies became liberalized to allow more private schools and people from all walks of life to be able to open up private schools. As you mentioned in your comments, with this, the 90s was another time of turmoil in Afghanistan, and education had suffered greatly. And the relationship between education and conflict is very interesting in Afghanistan, but that's maybe another discussion, maybe in the question and answers. But when the Taliban government was running the country in 2001, the estimates are that there was about 500,000 students. In 2021, the number of students had grown to about 10.5 million students. So this was an exponential growth. And this exponential growth was, there were several factors that affected it. One was the biggest one was the changes that took place politically, and Afghanistan became part of the Education for All initiatives, the Millennium Development Goals, that then transformed into the Sustainable Development Goals. So there was a big push for access. And this access with a system that was not very active. The system had to be built with the number of students that were entering into the schools. So part of the reason private schools took seat in Afghanistan was to meet this demand. And with this demand, there was this issue that with the access, quality was beginning to become more and more of a concern for families. Contact time decreased substantially between the time that, especially if you compare 1960s and between 2000 and 2021, the number of contact hours that students had was, especially in language arts and mathematics, was cut in half, which that in itself raises a lot of issues. So people began to be interested in private schools. And the overall focus of my dissertation was, what do private schools look like in Afghanistan? What's the difference between private and public schools? And then what are the drivers of the policy? The last part was the sort of the heart of the focus. Most of the private schools, the curriculum was the same. However, they offered more contact hours. Their teachers were generally less qualified, but younger in age, and the student-teacher ratio was smaller for private schools. Quality is very difficult to tell. It's all over the board. There were public school students that did very well, and then there was private schools. There wasn't really any substantial studies done on this, and then even qualitative or anecdotal data showed that it was a diversity between the two. The policy implication, why did the government change for 100 years almost? They didn't allow private schools, but then they allowed to, the ministry in 2006 decided to allow private schools. One was this international pressure to meet the access demands. The other was ideological pushes from because private schools have become a mechanism to meet the quality and access issues in the developing world. So World Bank, USAID, they are more favorable to this issue. And the ministry itself saw private schools as a mechanism to take off some of its load and give it to somebody else, because as you can see, from 500,000 to 10.5 million in a span of 2 decades in education is a tremendous growth that the country wasn't able to really handle very well. So it was looking for alternatives. And then the other interesting aspect of this privatization of education was in a place like the United States. Our taxes pay for the educational system, our property taxes specifically in the areas that we are in. So the public education system is responsive to the constituents. In a place like Afghanistan or many other developing countries, the dynamic is different. The money for education and a lot of other programs comes from international donors. And so the government has this torn role that its responsibility and its accountability in a lot of cases is first and foremost to the international donors, because they're funding the programs, and then to the constituency and to the public. So how the private sector plays a part in this is an interesting area that needs further investigation, but it does give this a little bit more of a national perspective on education, because it's funded through tuitions that people pay, but then it introduces a lot of the issues of equity and access, that the more well-to-do can have better education than people who are not as economically blessed. So that's, I hope I've been able to cover a vast subject in a short period of time, because I know that we have time limits, and I want to make sure that we have time for question and answers and some of your other questions right now.
Great, Omar. That was a great overview of the work that you've done on private education in Afghanistan and the complexities that surround it. Of course, private education in the United States is very controversial as well. If we think about voucher programs and other forms of privately supported education. And so we're aware that the issues that surround that are difficult. And I think it's even more difficult in a fragile state such as Afghanistan, where resources are hard to come by, and people are seeking quality education for their children with few opportunities. So it really is quite a different context. I think we want to get to question and answer here in a few minutes, but let me just raise one quick thing. Quite recently, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a new development with regard to education and teachers, in particular in Afghanistan. Omar, you mentioned this to me the other day, that given the situation with the Taliban, one of the problems has been that teachers were not being paid, that they were not receiving their salaries. And so that obviously creates enormous problems. But apparently, from what you mentioned the other day, UNICEF, international organization, has stepped in and is going to be providing payment for teachers in Afghanistan. On the surface, sounds like a good thing. It may be a solution to a very difficult problem there. Perhaps there are other complications that come along with this. Could you talk a little bit about this new initiative from UNICEF and what's some of the policy implications or unintended consequences, perhaps, of this initiative that they've taken on to pay the teachers in Afghanistan? Omar, you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. I think it's a very interesting development and an interesting scenario, and both from an educational perspective and from a global politics perspective. So the Taliban came into power in Afghanistan, a lot of people would say through mainly through the agreement that was signed between the Taliban and President Trump, which then President Biden put into effect. So they came into power on August 15th. From then until right now, education has been, there's no real formal education that's taken place from what I understand. People who are going to school, whether teachers or students, are doing it voluntarily because teachers are not getting paid. The general population is not certain about the political outcomes of what's going to happen. Nobody has recognized the Taliban government. Recently, in the last month or so, but this was the precursors to this, was actually even, if you look back at UNICEF, they were taking these precautions even a year before the fall of the Taliban, because they actually initiated an understanding and signed an agreement with the Taliban to support basically the same thing, support teachers in the Taliban areas directly. The president of the country, President Ghani, was irate about this activity of UNICEF, and he ended up kicking out the UNICEF head from the country because of this. Now, at the moment, UNICEF is proposing to pay 2 months' salary for teachers, $100. They're calling it a stipend for 2 months, which is going to end up being about $40 million to give teachers something so that they can continue their life. However, there's no direct logic of how this is related to education, because UNICEF and all of these other entities do not recognize the Taliban government. And because of, I think there's 3 or 4 legal sanctions against the Taliban government, they're not allowed to legally deal with them. So they have to go through these cracks in order to be able to give teachers their salaries. This has several implications. Number one, the good part of it is that those teachers who haven't gotten paid for a very long time, they will probably get some money. However, if it's done outside of the ministry system, whatever ministry exists right now, it creates a parallel government. Afghanistan, as I mentioned at the beginning, education has always been a source of conflict. And if education is seen as something foreign again, it might create animosity for the current government, for the overall, for the international community, and so forth. The issue of corruption has been a large issue in Afghanistan for many, many decades, and especially in the last 2 decades. And there is no clear, transparent manner as far as how this money is going to get to teachers through a UNICEF mandate that cannot officially work with the ministry. So they have to find mechanisms to pay these teachers, and unofficially, from what I understand, they have been getting some lists, but these lists are are prone to favoritism, they're prone to misuse. And then the whole mechanism at the larger level, this UNICEF initiative is part of a larger initiative called the 2022 Humanitarian Response Plan for Afghanistan, headed by OCHA, a UN organization. And that is about $4.2 billion for 1 year. And the education portion of that is about 162 million. How much of that money is going to get to programming is extremely unclear. And then the checks and balances of where this money is going to be used, there is no checks and balances within this system. It's one entity that's going to be working with other entities as subordinates to dish out this money. Save the Children is working with UNICEF to some extent, but the lead is with UNICEF. And being a fragile state, a state in conflict, dumping this much money into a country in a short period of time without clear policy and programming is very risky. I'm sure the intentions of a lot of people working on this is very good, but one of the reasons for the instability of the previous government was the amount of money that was dumped into the country. There was more money in Afghanistan than the Marshall Plan. And as you very well know, countries have an absorption capacity. And that absorption capacity right now within the country is very low. And when the money that goes into the country exceeds that absorption capacity, then it, instead of helping, it could cause a lot of problems. So I have, as you can tell, I have a lot of concerns, but we'll see how this thing plays out. From what I understood, as of yesterday, this plan has become sort of semi-official. They haven't done the formal announcement except through Al Jazeera that reported on it yesterday. But it's soon going to be announced that they're going to do this. And as a goodwill gesture, the Taliban government have said that they will allow girls to go back to school. And that in itself has a lot of issues as far as what that means. What does that really mean for education? My guess was that they were going to do that anyways. So yeah, I hope I've answered.
And Terry, if I may interrupt, we are at 2:32, and so questions are emerging. And if I may read to you the questions, is that okay with you, Omar and Terry?
Okay by me.
Okay, so
Sure, that's fine, yes.
one of the questions comes from Diane, and she works with she has the Bloomington Refugee Network here. And one of the questions that she has is, do the curricula of private versus public schools, do they differ significantly?
That's an excellent question. And there's two parts of that, two parts to that answer. So there's the regular private schools, and then there's the international private schools. The majority of the schools, 98%, are the regular private schools. The regular private schools, as of the last policy, they were required to teach the same curriculum as the public schools. However, they could supplement their curriculum with additional specifically language, English, and science subjects that they would add to the ministry's curriculum. But that was sort of up to them. The thing that they had to teach was the public school curriculum. International schools, which as of my last account, there was only 3 international schools. They were free to teach whatever curriculum as long as the ministry approved it.
So the other question is the question on modernization. Unless Diane wants to follow up with other questions, she's free to chime in. The other question is about modernization in education. What does that mean when you say modern education? Is that in Afghanistan, is that different from other forms of education? And I think a follow-up question to that is what is the role and how has Islam shaped education in Afghanistan? Does it look any different from what we're used to in the West?
Again, an excellent question. And so the reason I used modern schooling is because education in Afghanistan, like most of the rest of the world, has at least 1,000 years or more history. And modern education is sort of a relatively new system of education. So in Afghanistan, the educational system, the traditional educational system is the Islamic educational system. Prior to that, it was prior to Islam, there was other forms of education that kind of adapted and then got joined into the Islamic educational system, if you can call it that, which was made out of learning circles, apprenticeships, schools in the masjids, people getting taught there, and then it culminated into the madrasa, which is what a lot of people have heard. In the past, the curricula of these entities was very vast. As colonization took place, the curriculum became quite reactionary. However, that system has always existed. And one of the problems of conflict in education within Afghanistan has been this tension between the modern educational system, the modern schooling, the model from the West and that came into a lot of the non-Western countries, and the madrasa and masjid schools. They saw themselves as competing. And if you follow the history of Afghanistan, a lot of the conflicts that exist in Afghanistan can be correlated with the byproducts of these two systems. Part of what we were trying to do in the Ministry of Education in the last year and a half was to bridge this gap, to make the entire system sort of a one ecosystem with multiple pathways. So I hope I answered your question.
I think the follow-up question is for those who are not familiar with the madrasa, masjid system. How would you describe that for us?
Well, the masjid and the madrasa system is similar in Afghanistan to a lot of other Muslim countries. Usually children go to the masjid when they're very young, and the curriculum is focused on reading and with the end goal of reading the Quran and just basic literacy. In the past, it contained numeracy, and even not in the distant past, there was a lot of literature that was taught there, poems and poetry, Saadi, Rumi. And then the madrasa system was sort of the higher level of, and is still the higher level of this progression, in which people go to the madrasas to specialize. Again, if you look at the curricula of the past, the madrasa curricula were quite vast because that was the only educational system. So Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who is known as the father of of medicine came out of that system. Rumi, Ghazali, all these luminaries that ended up actually influencing the Enlightenment and the a lot of the educational advancements in the West came from these systems. However, towards more recent history, the curricula of madrasas became more restricted to just subjects that were focused on Sharia, meaning the Quranic sciences, the sciences of Hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, and the likes. So the curriculum became confined, and the larger picture of this is a reaction to colonization that Afghanistan had, like many other countries. They became defensive instead of open to discourse. And then the sort of the common things that people know about the madrasas as far as how they're related to Taliban. The Taliban came from the madrasa system. But there have been plenty of studies that also talk about the fact that the correlation between terrorism and madrasas is really not very strong. Terrorism has emerged from modern schooling just as much as from the madrasa system. And there's been several very, very good studies that have been done across the region and the Muslim world and in Afghanistan that shows that there are people from the madrasa that come out extremely radical, and so are people that come out from the modern schooling.
I'm getting questions from multiple channels, but before I share them, Terry, are there questions that you have that you want to continue with Omar?
Well, we want to get to the other questions also, but let me just throw one out in particular. I think with the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the world became very concerned in a variety of ways about what that was going to mean. I think foremost amongst those concerns was and is, what will education be like? In other words, in particular, the concern whether girls' education will be allowed, and what form will it take, what ages will be allowed to go to school, and other related questions. I realize that this is probably not possible to formulate a complete and concrete answer to this question, but Omar, you do have more inside information about this than most of the rest of us. So what are your thoughts about what might happen, and also what conditions will have to be in place for this kind of thing to happen? In other words, for schooling to be instituted under the Taliban.
That's a very, very difficult question, and I'll give you my general feelings and thoughts about it. This is one of the major concerns as far as what would education look like, and what would girls' education look like in particular. As of now, the Taliban have really not given any definitive policy statements. They've just given tidbits. But from their past history, this is of a great concern for a lot of people, first of all, not in Afghanistan and in the international community. The indications that I'm hearing, and this is the difficulty, is that there has been a lot of negotiations that has taken place with the Taliban. The negotiations that took place in Qatar between the US government and the Taliban spanned over 5 years. The document, from what I understand, is 100 pages. What has been made public is 4 pages. And we know that there's annexes that are secret and classified. So I don't know what they've agreed to. exactly in terms of what they're going to do with education. But what I'm hoping is that it's not what I call a straw man argument. And that's what I'm afraid of. That this discussion that we will give you money, you let girls go to school. This is a very easy win for the Taliban government, because given the changes in Afghanistan, I don't think that they could have banned girls' education. So I think we need to hold them to greater accountability. And this is part of the reason I'm very concerned about how this aid for education is going into the country. I would much rather have the aid go through the current ministry with very clear conditions, because it's one thing to let girls go to school. You can do it in many, many different forms. It's another to make sure that they're getting access to quality education, that their teachers are high quality, that their curriculum is going to be similar, that they're what they're going to do with the education is going to be useful. So the entire ecosystem needs to be talked about, not just these very easy low-hanging fruit things that we're putting up at this point. So I'm hoping that this conversation will have more meat into it down the road. But I'm very concerned. I really don't know. What I'm hearing from my sources on the ground who are still involved in the ministry is that most likely they're not going to make a lot of policy changes from what was in 2018 and 2019. They might follow a lot of the similar things. They might make some small changes in the curriculum, but not anytime soon, because publishing books is a very costly activity. And we just got books in 2021 in July. So they're not going to be able to publish any new books. So they're going to probably use those. There might be some separation of girls and within schools and the schools themselves. So those are some kind of thoughts all over the place.
Thank you, Omar, for those reflections on that. Obviously, I put you on the spot with a question that is a very difficult question to answer, given the information that we have available, but clearly you have more knowledge about this than many of the rest of us. I guess at the very least, we can be hopeful in a sense that Taliban 2.0, if we want to call it that, will not be the same as the original version of it. And that there may, for the reasons that you mentioned, there may be a continuation of some of the progress that was made during the years between 2001 and 2021. Certainly, those of us who were involved in education in Afghanistan at that time, during those times, are hopeful that that will, in fact, be the case. Can we turn it over to some other questions now, Farida? Do you want to?
Yes. So I have several interesting questions. The first one is as we mentioned earlier, several of us are working with the refugee network. And one of the concerns is that, not quite concerns, but one of the questions is that what are some of the approaches that you feel are good approaches to take, effective approaches to take in working with the refugees in terms of teaching classrooms and also in terms of teacher training, since we're the School of Education?
And this is a question for refugees who have come to the US, right?
Correct.
Yeah, Afghan refugees, yes. That's so I think language is going to be the number one issue. Working and it depends on obviously what age group you're working with. But across the board, I think that helping and kind of delving into an immersion program of sorts to make sure that these people acquire language, because that will open up a lot of doors for them. is probably the most critical thing that I would recommend. The other aspect, especially for older Afghans who might want to join the work environment, I'm actually working with several apprenticeship programs and unions to try to place some of these Afghans into apprenticeship programs if they like to go that route. So I think that's an interesting idea. I'm sure as you work with Afghans, you'll see that they are eager to learn, and they're usually good students. I think just some patience with them and working on the basics and kind of working on an individual level as much as possible, because all of these people have come from very diverse backgrounds, from people with no literacy to professors that have come. So individual approaches, I think, is also an important principle to keep in mind.
Yeah, I can attest to that because through the work that you've done with Terry and through Terry's program, the students that we've had here from Afghanistan have been incredible. They've just been wonderful to work with and have been really interesting individuals as well that bring a lot to the discussion. There's an interesting question here because you mentioned earlier about Western education and quote unquote traditional education, and you were talking about finding the middle, resolving the disparity. What is that middle?
Well, that's the $1 million question, right? And part of that is education has to be contextualized. Education has to, there's two sides of it. It has to have roots in whatever country you're working with, whatever community you're working with. Even in the US, the research shows that if education is not tied to communities and is seen as as something foreign to the community, you don't see the same level of results as programs that are very in tune with the community. So it needs roots in that community, and then it also needs to look outwards and enriching the curriculum, so new things are introduced, new ways of thinking are introduced. So I think that's the challenge. How to do that has been a very, very difficult thing. The private school that I started in Afghanistan, it's called Mizan International School. And Mizan is, the word itself means balance. And what we try to do with that, and it is an elite school, but we try to have Afghan values, Islamic principles, and international standards. That was sort of our motto, to find the middle ground between these three so that people feel connected to education culturally, religiously, from an identity perspective, and also being prepared for the international community to be productive members of the larger international community. That's my hope, but it's a tall order.
Let me add something to that. I'm remembering back to the work that Omar and I did in Afghanistan, where we were preparing teacher education materials for science education. And one of the things I was very impressed with that Omar really headed up in that process was to find ways to integrate elements of Islamic history and culture into the science curriculum. By that, I mean that when introducing scientific principles and scientific research and so forth, there was an attempt to show how this kind of scientific inquiry had been carried out in traditionally Islamic countries and cultures and at different periods of time. And what it did was, as Omar just said, it created a link for the students between their own history and culture and the areas of science that they were investigating. I thought that was a really interesting way to do it, and was a good example of how to achieve this middle that Omar mentioned.
I mean, they're fantastic. Are there questions? We're kind of shooting out the questions, Omar, but are there questions that we're not asking that you feel are vital?
I think this conversation has been a very, very good conversation, and I'm open to any of the other questions. I know that time is limited, so I'm not going to take time with my my questions. So if there's any other questions that are out there, I'm open to discuss.
But I think we want to know, I think the question is, I think we want to know what's at the topmost of your head, you know, being someone from the inside. And when we're coming in to help, and again, the question is, again, we're externals trying to assist. And so the internal, the emic view is you know, is something that we do not often hear. So from your perspective, what are the burning issues at this point in time that needs to be addressed?
I think there are many burning issues, unfortunately, in Afghanistan. I think having a clear dialogue that is open for the Afghans within Afghanistan, for the international community, and for the general community across the globe to talk about what education means in Afghanistan is critically important. Transparency and educational programming is going to be number one issue to make sure that education is not used for conflict. Sustainability of educational programming is extremely, extremely important. It's really easy for international community, international organizations to come in and put up a program for 5 years, 10 years, 2 years, spend a lot of money, but then it cannot be sustained within the overall infrastructure of education. And the programming that we did with Terry in Indiana University, that was one of the main things that we tried to focus on to make sure that the interventions were localized and could be sustained locally. I remember a conversation that we had about lab equipment because we dealt with science labs at the universities. The first reaction of a lot of the people that we worked with, the professors, was to get us top-rated lab equipment. We went through a 3-month period of discussion with them saying, okay, what is the purpose of these lab equipment? It is to enrich laboratories and high schools. So at the end of our discussions, both the professors and the program agreed that any lab equipment that could not be found locally in the 34 provinces would not be part of the package that we designed the program on. Because yes, we could provide those lab equipment quickly right now, but it would gather dust, and because people thought it was too valuable and not used, and then it wouldn't be sustainable. As soon as those things broke down, then the whole program would break down. So that's one of the areas, but as I said, there's many burning issues, unfortunately.
So we have a couple of minutes, actually. Terry, do you want to wrap up or say a few words? There was one question that I think I'll ask at the end that just came in. But Terry, do you want to chime in and share a few thoughts?
No, not actually. I think I want to thank Omar for joining us today. I think his experience in Afghanistan is so interesting and valuable for all of us who are still concerned about the future of that country, particularly in the area of education. So it was great to hear from him. And I want to encourage him, of course, to continue that work as he moves forward in his career, and I'm sure he will. I'll turn it back to you, Farida. Apparently there's at least one other question. We have a little bit of time left, but I'll turn it back to you, and we'll close out from there.
Right, there's one last question. I thought it was such a fitting question, which is, you know, from the perspective of outsiders, when we hear these the changes in the government, all those other things that are happening, but in your eyes, Omar, what is the shining light? What stands out as a hopeful, silver lining that we may look toward and cling our hopes to, changes in education that will create new pathways for everyone, women included?
The silver lining for me has always been the people of Afghanistan. Afghans are very resilient people. We have gone through many ups and downs in history, and the Afghan people have managed to overcome and actually improve from the conflict. So at this point, the silver lining for me is the people themselves. My faith in them that they will be able to manage this process and hopefully come up with a practical, pragmatic solution. And that's another factor that's very often a characteristic of the Afghan population, to come up with pragmatic solutions that answer immediate questions and concerns for the population who are living there.
I think that's a wonderful ending, and I thank you, Dr. Qargha, and I thank you as well, Dean Mason, for your time today. We've learned quite a lot in 1 hour, and we are so appreciative of your time to share with us your insights and your expertise. So thank you again for your time and expertise. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Goodbye. Thank you.
All right.